Then let's look at methods in international political economy. If we look at methods, it's helpful to first look at the relation between methods and theory. In theory, we can distinguish three dimensions. The first dimension is the ontology. This is the question, how is the world structured? Here we can distinguish, for example, the three approaches I just sketched. So in economic nationalism, we have the claim that the world is structured by states struggling for power and wealth, or economic liberalism says the world is structured by individuals and businesses encountering on the markets. Critical theories are claiming that the world is structured by structures of power and domination and exploitation, and those are all claims about the way the world is. So these are ontological claims. The second dimension is epistemology. This is about the question, what can we know and how can we know it? And in the simplest case, you're simply a realist or empiricist, and then epistemology is not a problem at all, because then you say, well, I just look at the way things are, and then I describe the world as it is. And then you don't have to think anymore about epistemology and how knowledge is created. On the other hand, if you are a constructivist, you will say, no, it's much more complicated than this, and you can never look at the world as it really is and then describe it as it really is. When you look at the world, you will always be guided by the way you are socialized, by your personal interests, by the discourses you are moving in, and so any impression you get from the world is always strongly influenced by your own situation, and even more, any account you give of the world, any description of reality is always a construction that you create based on your former knowledge you gained through culture and discourses and so on. And then you can make this claim more or less radically. Or finally, you could say, well, I'm a critical realist, I'm somewhere in between. I say it's more complicated than just describing the world the way it is, but you can kind of do this if you reflect on the limits of your capacity for knowledge. The third dimension is normativity. Here we ask the question, what is desirable? Here you can, for example, be a nationalist and say the best world is one in which my state is the strongest. You can be a liberal democrat, you can be a socialist, you can say, well, I'm all for emancipation, meaning that everyone should liberate themselves. Or you could say, no, I'm a scientist, I don't do normativity, that's something for moral philosophers maybe, but we don't do this here. I'm hardly ever very convinced by these kind of claims because they typically come with some kind of status quo bias, meaning de facto you're quite okay with the way things are, even though you're saying you're not judging anything. And finally, we can come to methodology, which relates to the other three dimensions, but is not directly derived from them. And in methodology, you ask, in which ways can we as scholars act to obtain knowledge of the world and then produce texts that we would consider scholarly texts that are worthy of being published in an academic journal, for example. And here you have quite a few decisions to make. For example, you can decide whether or not you do quantitative work, qualitative work, or mixed work. Quantitative mainly means you work with numbers and make some calculations based on these numbers. Qualitative approaches typically try to understand things that are not easily grasped in numbers, which is very important in the social sciences. Or you can say, well, I kind of do both and I take some numbers here and do something with them, but then I contextualize them in knowledge that I gather from understanding discourses, for example. Another decision that you have to make relates to the number of cases that you look at. For example, you could say, well, I do a single case study. I only look at the way the United States react to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then I'm done with my research, but I do this very, very thoroughly, and I apply good theories to this case, and so I obtain important knowledge by just looking at this one case. Or you can say, I don't do this, I rather compare three cases. So I, for example, compare the reactions of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg to the crisis, and you say, well, these three countries are rather similar, but their reactions were quite different. So this is interesting to look at, and then you're doing a comparative study. Or you say, three isn't enough, I look at all 200 countries and their kinds of reactions, and then I even differentiate between the 50 states of the United States, and then they maybe have 250 cases, and then I look at how do these governments react, and then you have a far greater number. And of course, those decisions relate to one another. So if you want to do a qualitative approach where you try to understand processes that are happening, you cannot work with 250 cases because you will take time for each case. With a quantitative analysis, you can do 250 cases, and even the more cases you have, the better it is. And then there are more and more methodological questions. What's important to emphasize here is that this is not a table. There is no direct horizontal connection between the cells in the columns. For example, it's not the case that all economic nationalists are empiricists and nationalists who do quantitative research with single case studies. In fact, this wouldn't make much sense. Rather, there are many combinations that are possible and plausible. For example, you could say, ontologically, I'm a critical theorist. Epistemologically, I'm a constructivist. Normatively, I'm for emancipation. Methodologically, I do qualitative research with large N studies. Or you could say, well, I'm a whole different kind of critical theorist. I'm an empiricist describing the world the way it really is. I'm for socialism, and I do qualitative research with single case studies. And there are many more combinations that could be plausible or possible, and you can pick and choose if you want to. If we then look at the three methodological approaches that are described in the textbook, we can see that they also cut across the categories that are just introduced. I want to explain this with the example of rational choice theory. If you are a rational choice theorist, you will create a theoretical model in which you argue that actors will make rational choices, which means they will try to optimize their results, to raise their gains and to lower their losses, and this is what rational action would be. So if you take this approach, you will have to assume that actors actually make rational choices. This does not actually mean that you have to believe that every human being in every situation always chooses the rational thing, but at least human action has to be guided by this kind of result optimizing rationality to some extent, because otherwise your theoretical approach wouldn't make sense. So you have already some ontological belief on how the world is structured, namely by actors acting rationally. When it comes to epistemology, you have to at least believe that you are able to see what would be rational for a certain actor in a certain situation. Because if you as a scholar would not be able to see this, understand this, and know this, then you couldn't apply your model to anything. When it comes to normativity, it's a little bit more complicated, or a little bit less clear what kind of normative approach a rational choice theorist would take. At least I would argue that rational choice theorists would always want a world in which human beings are able to act rationally, which means that they are able to foresee the results of their actions. Because if you as a human being cannot see what will result from your actions, then this would probably be a horrible world for rational choices. When it comes to methodology, in the narrow sense, there are also some decisions that are made as soon as you say you follow a rational choice approach. Because if you follow a rational choice approach, you have to have a methodology in which actors, their decisions, and their situations under which they make the decisions have a central role. Because if you don't have a method where these variables are important, then you cannot apply your approach at all. And you could also make similar cases how a constructivist or institutionalist approach also cuts across all these categories. But I don't want to spell this out here in detail. Instead, I want to close today's lecture by briefly looking at two transformations in international political economy with lowercase letters as a subject field and international political economy with capital letters as an academic discipline. The first of these two transformations began in the early 1970s and is sometimes referred to as the end of the golden age of capitalism. This term, the golden age of capitalism, refers to the 3 decades after World War II. This was a time when the economy in all Western industrialized countries was marked by high growth rates, by increases in wages, and by high profit rates. So at least if you look at it from a distance, it might have seemed that everybody was winning in this type of capitalism. And this was also the heyday of Keynesian economics in the academy as well as in state politics. And this was also the time of the Bretton Woods currency system. This is something we'll talk about more in a later session. All of this came to an end in the early 1970s. And if you want to choose one event that marks this end, it might be the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, or rather the United States opting out of the Bretton Woods system causing its collapse. Because the United States were the most important economy and the most important political actor, so without them there was no Bretton Woods system anymore. But the United States did not do this because they simply felt like it, or they didn't do it because they think, well, high growth rates, increases in wages and high profit rates, that's nothing for us. It's rather they did so because there were signs that the system was no longer working, and in particular that it was no longer working for the United States. So the economy was not as glorious as it used to be in the 50s and 60s, and the United States also witnessed a relative decline of their power vis-a-vis the European countries or vis-a-vis Soviet Union. Then also in the early 1970s, we witnessed a big global recession. So it's not only that the United States ended the system didn't seem to be working anymore, so the United States and others ended it. And what came after it was an era of economic liberalization across the board, and also an era of globalization. So we saw an increase in international trade, an increase in international investment, an increase in migration and financialization. We're going to talk about all these things more in the coming sessions, and these processes were then accelerated in the 1990s when the heyday of globalization began. One might argue that right now we are witnessing a transformation of a similar scale in international political economy. This might be the end of globalization as we knew it that we are seeing. Once again, this transformation becomes most clearly visible in a change of US policy. The United States used to be the torchbearers of economic liberalism and of free trade. And now, under the presidency of Donald Trump, they reconsidered this position. And once again, it would be far too simplistic to say they did so because they just didn't feel like it anymore. Much rather, they did so because the old system of free trade didn't seem to be working for them anymore or working at all. And once again, this shift in US policy coincides with economic troubles of a global scale. So we had the global recession of 2008, 2009, and as many argue, it was never really overcome and the economy never really recovered from this. Once again, we saw a relative decline of US power, this time particularly vis-a-vis China, and this time it might happen that the current corona crisis might even accelerate these processes. But this, of course, is something we don't know. And I want to emphasize this more. The first transformation, this definitely happened. So we definitely saw the end of the golden age of capitalism. Whether we are seeing the end of the age of globalization right now, this is yet to be seen. And in order to see it and understand it, we have to study international political economy. And I'm very glad that we all can do this in the coming weeks. Thank you for staying with me till the end. And we'll see you again on Friday when I will answer your questions. Goodbye and have a good day.